fabulous to see so many come out for our lunchtime seminar series, our spotlight series on research. I'd like to begin by acknowledging we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, pay my respect to elders past and present, and acknowledge the importance and significance of Indigenous knowledges in the Academy, and in particular in the Arts faculty. So it's my great pleasure to host today's event. My name's Sally Young. I'm the Associate Dean Research, and I'm also a Professor in Australian Politics and Media in the Arts faculty. So we're thrilled to have, for our first Spotlight series, Robyn Sloggett. Now, it's hard for me to overhype Robyn and her legacy and impact, but I'll try. So Robyn, as many of you will be aware, and I know that some of you here are already aware of Robyn's great work, but let me give you a brief summary. Robyn's an internationally recognised expert in cultural materials conservation and the inaugural director of the Grimwade Centre for Cultural Materials Conservation and the inaugural Cripps Foundation Chair of Cultural Materials Conservation. So there's a definite theme there of research.
Cultural Materials Conservation.
In 2021, Robyn was awarded the Miles Medal from the University of Melbourne, which recognises excellence in research impact, and was awarded for interdisciplinary cross-cultural research in arts conservation and the significant impact it has had on the communities with whom she has collaborated. And this year, to our great delight in the Arts faculty, we were thrilled that Robyn was awarded an ARC Industry Laureate for the program Safekeeping, Affecting Solutions for Risks to Remote Indigenous Heritage, working with Arnhem, Northam and Kimberley artists and the International Art Services. And I'm not sure if you're aware how difficult it is to get an ARC laureate. It's a hugely important and significant and inspiring thing for us to have Robyn showing us the way in terms of these big, grand, nationally and internationally significant projects. So we're thrilled.
So I want to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders, emerging elders and other Indigenous people in the room here with us today. I also want to acknowledge particularly the Indigenous partnerships that inform the work at the Grimwade Centre and particularly inform my research. So we talked about the laureate as a kind of single sole trader kind of enterprise, but it's absolutely not. And the input from Indigenous senior knowledge holders and their patience and charity in working with us as we stumble through what for us is a really important partnership, I think really warrants some acknowledgement. And I particularly want to thank the elders in the Gija community. So I've just been back from 3 weeks in Warman. It's much warmer and it was fabulous, but it's brought home to me just the significance of these partnerships in what we do at the university and the difficulty in holding them together and keeping them sustainable for decades really, which is what's needed. So, having said that, let me launch into my presentation for today. I want to present an argument for you today that access to cultural, historical, scientific and heritage records is a critical human capability that has direct impact on community, empowerment, freedom of speech, the enablement of democracy and the integrity of public institutions. I see cultural materials conservation as key, absolutely key, a basic premise in how universities operate, because it is the discipline that ensures that our material record, which we rely on so much, and our digital record, is available from generation to generation. That's what's at the core of the discipline. I'm arguing that central to functioning agency is the capability to assess, access, and respond to a relative cultural record, and that without an authentic cultural record, it becomes difficult to imagine our own personhood or that of others, or to understand the trajectory of human development, because we simply lack those reference points that locate our identity. The iteration of culture, the development of identity, and the verification of histories all require the existence of and access to an authentic cultural record. Without cultural records that are able to be interrogated, in ways that enable us to understand what is a coherent truth, that is a truth that has context, can be contested, and maintains rigour when tested, we do not have the tools to understand the past, nor to make effective decisions about the future. And perhaps most importantly, we cannot locate our creativity within a human framework, and cultural creation becomes singular, idiosyncratic, and solipsistic. The authentic cultural record is therefore essential to any fundamental understanding of human capability, and that's what I want to focus on today. I'm using three concepts of points of departure: the accounting term, information asymmetry; Karen Berard's term, the requisite question of accountability; and the United Nations Brisbane's declaration, the right to know, to explain why the discipline of cultural materials conservation, which has been seen as a material-based practice focused on object and collection care, is at its core a values, it's a bit echo, isn't it? A values-based social proposition that is a necessary condition for an equitable, democratic, pluralistic society. All three concepts are informed by access to material culture, and all three underpin major contemporary issues in areas of free speech, equity, and education. So why this is important and unique at the University of Melbourne, which I strongly believe it is. We are in a very special position in the way that we can think about interdisciplinarity within the Faculty of Arts around the idea of material culture. This alignment between identity, knowledge, and access to cultural, historical, scientific and heritage records forms the basis for the values argument in my ARC Industry Laureate Fellowship application, in which I argued that addressing the creeping, escalating risks to Australian Aboriginal-owned and managed cultural material in remote communities was a critical concern of national importance. It was a good fortune that this argument was considered cogent and worthy of support, and I'm very grateful that the ARC had the wisdom to fund it. So let's start with information asymmetry. In contract and economic theory, information asymmetry is a term that's used to describe how privileged access to information creates unequal benefit. When one group is better able to make decisions because they have better access to more information or better information. The asymmetry is understood across societies. It's not a cultural issue. It forms the basis of share market takeovers, of big men politics, of economic advantage, and of disciplinary privilege. In collecting institutions, it sits at the core of pushbacks regarding repatriation and the argument that scientific investigation should be a primary decider of whether objects and human remains are repatriated, and we're probably all familiar with that binary debate. Information asymmetry is a key for democracies and for the instruments of state, such as education institutions. I think it sits at the core of the value of the HASS disciplines in a place like the University of Melbourne. Most of all, however, it is a key issue for communities that have been colonised, marginalised or oppressed. And despite people like James Kuno championing the idea of universal or encyclopedic museums where material from around the globe can be shared, information asymmetry remains a continual tool of oppression. Information asymmetry also presents a possible metric for formative assessments of social equity. For example, in understanding and assessing the ways in which lack of access to well-preserved cultural material reduces the possibilities for information enhancement, educational achievement, and knowledge advancement. By way of example, Rover Thomas, one of Australia's most well-known and well-respected artists, along with Trevor Nichols, was the first Indigenous artist, the first two Indigenous artists, to represent Australia at the Venice Biennale in 1990. In 2001, the National Gallery's purchase of All That Big Rain Coming Down from Topside for just over $750,000 was the highest price paid for Aboriginal art at the time. There are a number of really seminal exhibitions, sole exhibitions for Rover Thomas, and they were all had education resources associated with them, developed by national and state galleries to enable teachers and their students visiting the exhibition to locate Rover Thomas as a significant international artist, and asked students to compare the themes in his art with Australia's Heidelberg School, for example, in landscape, or Pablo Picasso's Guernica in relation to massacres, and asking what is the role of art for artists and communities who are coming to terms with tragic events. And that's from the Art Gallery New South Wales Education Kit. In the remote Aboriginal community of Warman, 200 miles southwest of Kununurra and home to around 450 Gija people, the Waterman Community Collection, held in the Waterman Arts Centre, has 4 Rover Thomas paintings, probably more, but some are still unidentified, as well as 6 works by his artistic mentor, Paddy Jamji, and 7 by his friend and colleague, Queenie Mackenzie. The Warman Roadhouse has a 4 metre by 2 metre serpent painting painted by Rover Thomas. Despite the proximity of Gija school children to these extraordinary resources, these works remain inaccessible because there is simply not the infrastructure or resource in Waterman to enable accessibility. This means a child in Balmain has a much better chance of learning about the significance of Rover Thomas to Australia, a better ability to locate him with the international art canon, and a better opportunity to articulate their ideas about Gija art history than a Gija student in Warman, surrounded by the works of Rover Thomas, by people who knew him, and by the country and its stories that he depicted. There are any number of similar examples of information asymmetry, where inequitable support for access to information leads to unequal benefit. In Australia, the passage of time, inverted commas, and again inverted commas, lack of surviving records, has become a common theme where Indigenous communities and individuals seek reparation. For example, the WA government established the Stolen Wages repatriation scheme in 2007. The actuary firm Barton Consulting modelled the likely value of the stolen wages and recommended a $10,000 payout. The government provided a maximum of $2,000 per person, based on the fact that, and I quote, the complexity of trust accounts in Western Australia, as well as the lack of surviving records and the passage of time, which we hear again and again, it would not be possible for the state government to identify and repay the actual amount of monies that were withheld from each person. So the default was $2,000. Similarly, the Palm Island wages case, Bligh and others versus State of Queensland, 1996. The Queensland government introduced the underpayment of award wages process in 1999 for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people employed by the government on Aboriginal reserves. Evidence of the Equal Opportunity Commission indicated loss of income for individual complainants of around 8,500 to around 21,000. Commissioner Carter decided to award $7,000 to each of the successful complainants due to, and I quote, difficulties in precisely accurately assessing their loss include the lack of records and faulty recollection. Similarly, in his statement in the members of the Yorta Yorta Aboriginal Community versus Victoria and others in 1998, Justice Olney wrote, "The tide of history has indeed washed away any real acknowledgement of their traditional law and any real observances of their traditional customs. The foundation of the claim to native title in relation to the land previously occupied by these ancestors having disappeared, the native title rights and interests previously enjoyed are not capable of revival." Again, this tide of history, loss of records, inability to access an authentic cultural record to provide verification. We hear it again and again. Justice Olney's judgment was critical for preferencing the written records of local squatter, Edmund Kerr, above that of the lived and oral evidence provided by the Yorta Yorta claimants. Yet appeals to the full federal court in 2001 and the High Court in 2002 failed to overturn this decision. And in the final appeal, the 2 dissenting judges noted Olney's decision was a finding of fact. Information asymmetry threatens people's ability to understand and interrogate the conditions that impact them. Important materials that have been removed from communities remain inaccessible, and significance is decontextualised. As such, it does not become a priority for conservation, and the cycle of potential loss remains unbroken. As time passes and these items remain unavailable to individuals or communities to whom they are most relevant, those with the ability to provide the information that enriches content pass away. So the context becomes lost. The outcome is that one group, enabled in a particular way, perhaps by proximity to collecting institutions, by language, to support a catalogue search, by education levels, or types that support an interest in historical inquiry, for example, have access to the information, but little ability to enhance this information and contextualise it, while those who can best inform the meaning of the item do not have access to the material. The net result is there is an overall reduction in the content of the human record. Information asymmetry also occurs when socio-economic factors limit conservation capability, and cultural, historical and scientific records relevant to communities cannot be preserved. Climate change represents particular risks here to cultural material held in Indigenous communities, and we see that escalating across the country. In such cases, the records of dominant and economically enabled communities are preserved as a resource into the future, and the records of less enabled community are lost. And this is what's happening, and this was the basis for the laureate. So now I want to move on to the idea of the right to know. The right of information is recognised in Resolution 59 of the UN General Assembly, 1946, and in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. It underpins capability theory, propounded by Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, who argue that for a properly effective life, people must have capability, not just functionality. In a community, functionality includes being able to access cultural material, heritage archives and literature to support development of ideas and history and identity, education and new forms of cultural development and strengthening. Capability involves the agency to take that functionality and drive futures with it. Australia led the way in the development of the UN Brisbane Declaration Declaration in 2010, which said, recalling the World Summit of the Information Society, which reaffirmed freedom of expression and universal access to information as essential foundations to inclusive knowledge societies. It reaffirmed the right to information as an integral part of the right to freedom of expression, and it said that both are fundamental underpinnings for democracy and all other rights and freedoms, fundamental underpinnings. Defined the right to information as the right of everyone to access information held by public bodies at all levels, local, national and international. That is not the current state of our society. The Declaration also emphasised, I quote, the right to information as critical for informed decision-making, for participation in democratic participation, public monitoring, transparency and accountability, and a powerful tool to fight corruption, and instrumental in people's empowerment, civic trust and social equity. So in our current times, the issue of fake news, which sits behind all of this, I think, in some ways, the issue of verification, validity, corroboration, the value of education, the value of scholarship, all of this is underpinned by having access to an authentic cultural record. In Australia, we're suffering the steady, relentless loss of Indigenous heritage, accelerated by events of catastrophic disaster. Disasters such as flooding, building collapse, theft attract national attention. But the slow, incremental deterioration of cultural material held in remotely located Indigenous communities remains a hidden national tragedy. The situation is urgent. Increasing loss undermining cultural sustainability. Increasingly, loss undermines cultural sustainability, creating a legacy of social asymmetry that conventional research programs have difficulty in addressing in Australia. We still lack the baseline data to properly inform policy and decision making. Responses remain piecemeal, and targeting specific issues, there is little in the offer of universities that helps address the current piecemeal responses. Our disciplinary silos work against having a national response to this crisis. And insecurity and social asymmetry continue to be supported in this loss of cultural heritage. And the right to know is still not secured for Indigenous people in Australia. This brings me to the final of the three concepts that frame this talk, Karen Barrad's The Requisite Question of Accountability. In Australia, our ecology of knowledge is depleted and it's depleting. Conservation is critical, both understanding this and developing the tools to help us address it. Equally as important is being able to identify spurious or malevolent insertions in this ecology. And they happen all the time, and they're increasingly taking up airspace and news space. When the building blocks of identity are not accessible, then capability within a cultural continuum is disrupted. And after significant cultural disruption, it can take generations for individuals to build the capacity to operate within unfamiliar cultures. And, we see that across the country. And when verifiability loses value, then culture, more than anything else, becomes a battleground for power, exclusion and privilege. As Karen Barrad notes, questions of responsibility and accountability present themselves with every possibility. Each moment is alive with different possibilities for the world's becoming and different reconfiguring what might be possible. And this to me is the role of universities, configuring, supporting what is possible. If, as researchers, we take our responsibilities for knowledge development and promulgation seriously, it raises two questions. What is our disciplinary response when our disciplines are found lacking? And what is our disciplinary responsibility for our university's response as the best endowed university in this country? So it's something I want to think about. Perhaps we can talk about it in the discussions. What is a disciplinary response when our disciplines are found lacking? What do we do as scholars? How do we build capacity, capability? How do we contest this lack in our disciplinary responses? And what's our disciplinary responsibility for our university's response as the best endowed university in the country? Where does our personal responsibility, our disciplinary responsibility align to the ambitions of the university and where there is failure within the university? What role do each of us take in pushing agendas forward that are as critical as the one I've been talking about today? Currently, the response of Australia's education system, and pretty much the response of the world over to Indigenous cultural knowledge, is to educate about rather than with, or more particularly, and more importantly, from. It's a trite description of the complexity, for sure, and of the problem we face in deconstructing monopoly and privilege that's been entrenched, for 250 years. And it's a structure of structural disappearing of significant Australian knowledge. But ensuring that we are prioritising preserving records that remain but are in jeopardy is a critical start. To respond to these questions, I think two things are required. First, we need to provide validation of the knowledge structures, systems and content held by the old people. Universities serve to undermine this knowledge as we strive for international benchmarks and prestigious global partnerships. Yet in Australia, the most important iteration of the more than 60,000 years of philosophy, medicine, land management, astronomy, and the rest, the light that goes on, is embodied in senior members of Indigenous communities, not in research papers published about them and about their knowledge. There is an urgent need to enable them within the structures that train our next generation of thinkers. At the same time, there needs to be an investment in the next generation of cultural knowledge holders, in addition to supporting emerging Indigenous leaders to become doctors, lawyers, and so on. There are emerging leaders who simply want to be cultural leaders. How do we enable them so that they can develop the necessary cultural materials literacy and critical object-focused analytical skills required to preserve cultural material in their communities? At the crux of this, I think, is a reformulation of the economic model that drives how we envisage our teaching, research and research translation. We need to invest in removing senior knowledge holders from job pathways schemes, picking up rubbish and cutting grass in communities, to being paid to provide cultural leadership. We need then to invest in creating opportunities for and acknowledging them as professors of their own cultural development and their community's cultural futures. At present, our education system at all levels asks Indigenous people to disrupt the chain of their cultural DNA. Culture construction is manifested by people with the ability to do so. Resourcing is a requisite part of developing this ability. Finally, I want to conclude on how our accountability plays out in the current political climate. In the infamous book burning on 10th of May 1933, one of the first targets that the Nazis seized on and burnt were the records of, excuse my shocking German accent, Institute for Sexualwissenschaft, which has been established by Magnus Hirschfeld in 1919. The Institute was a world leader in scientifically led research and approaches to sex education, contraception, gay rights, women's rights, and LGBTQI community members. It was Hirschfeld who termed the coin transgender. In March of 1933, the Nazis had begun to build concentration camps. The first opening on Wednesday, 22nd of March, in Dachau, with an accommodation for 5,000 people. On 23rd of March, 1923, a day later, the Institute director, Kurt Hiller, who was also chairman of the gay activist group, was arrested and then released, only to be re-arrested on 2nd of April and sent to the Oranienburg concentration camp on 14th of July. The Institute was influential globally, with around 20,000 visitors per annum. Its extraordinary archive of over 20,000 books, a vast amount of patient and client records, historic photos and scientific studies were all seized and completely destroyed. In May 2024, the Cumberland City Council banned same-sex parenting books from council libraries, I quote, "for the safety of our children." I don't need to join the dots on that. This is an attack on cultural plurality, and particularly in Hass disciplines, cultural plurality provides researchers with two things: an ability to see and understand the continuity of ideas, practices, and identity that form a sense of community, whether that is a community of belief, of practice, of education, or any other form of community. And second, the ability to disrupt this belief in the continuity of ideas, practices, and identity in order to build new and often stronger or more effective or relevant communities. There's two things there. There's the continuity, but the disruption. And both of them are absolutely central to how we operate as scholars. Access to an authentic cultural record not only enables education opportunities, but ensures that our history, perception, political and justice systems are able to be interrogated in ways that help us to understand what is a coherent truth. Without an authentic cultural record, we do not have the tools to understand the past, nor to make effective decisions about the future. This project, for the conservation of cultural, historic, scientific and heritage records, is one of the most important engagements for the disciplines in the Faculty of Arts in our current socio-political and economic climate. And I'd be very happy to hear from anyone here today who wants to join with the Grimwade Centre on this journey. Interdisciplinary is at the core of the differences that we will make going forward as a faculty. Dr. Jumbo Mawarili, Chair of ANCA, wrote in the Safekeeping Report, that was the informing document for my laureate, and it examined risks to Aboriginal cultural material held in remote communities. He said, "If it is lost, there is no collection. People will lose their identity in their soul and their blood. Only a few living people are left now who have deep knowledge and responsibility for ceremony and law. This is what we are laying down. That is why we have to keep those patterns and designs alive. To remind people of Yirritja and Dua. To keep culture alive in our blood and our soul. We need to continue looking after and caring for these collections. To have other tools to teach so that art and patterns will be safe, clean and well looked after. That is important. That is the history of Australia." Thank you very much for listening.